Welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, where we interview top financial professionals and deconstruct their practices to give you an insider look into the world of finance. Here are your hosts, Lucas Muzialski and Leo Severino.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the second season of the Wall Street Lab podcast, or episode 16, as this naming scheme gets ambiguous pretty quickly.
Hi, hello, good morning from my side as well. And as you can hear from Luke's voice, it's quite early in the morning here in Germany. And given Luke now has his startup, he doesn't have time for any sleep anymore. So today we had the pleasure to introduce to you Carl Richards, who we interviewed a few months ago, and he was kind enough to find the time to talk to us. And he actually lives in New Zealand, so it was in the evening here in Germany, and I remember it was 6 a.m. In New Zealand, and he sounded a lot better than Luke does. Apparently, he's a morning person, unlike we are.
I do my best.
So Carl Richards, for those of you who don't know him, he has a traditional finance background as a wealth manager, but he's well known now for being the author of a best-selling book called The Behavior Gap, and he's also known for being a longtime writer for the New York Times and his very interesting and simplistic sketches. If you actually Google New York Times Carl Richards, you find all his articles and his sketches there. They're quite entertaining. We talk about a bunch of different things during the interview, but the way I see Carl is someone who is really good at explaining difficult concepts in a very simplistic way without losing the essence of the message, and he really passes that message on during the interview. We talk about behavioral finance, of course, which is a big thing for him, and the relationship between the financial professional or the financial advisor and the clients, and the importance of building trust and making these concepts as easy to understand as possible. I mean, we talk about many other things, but those are the highlights. I really enjoyed interviewing Carl, and I hope this will be entertaining and educational for all of you. Now, we would love some feedback as always. If you have any questions that we can answer, feel free to shoot us an email at contact@thewallstreetlab.com. Or if you have any follow-up questions to Carl, also make sure to send those questions our way, and we'll make sure that we pass them along.
Yeah, and without further ado, here is our interview with Carl Richards.
Well, Carl, thank you very much again for agreeing to talk to us here at the Wall Street Lab. Let's just start by telling us where you are right now and what are you doing there?
That's a good question. I am in New Zealand, and it's funny, we get asked all the time. I get asked all the time, like, what are you doing in New Zealand? Or normally the question is, why did you move to New Zealand? And I've come up with I love to test answers, and I've come up with all different answers, but the best answer I've come up with is just simply to say New Zealand, right? That's why we're here. We've wanted to have an experience of living outside the United States for as long as my wife and I have been married, which is now 22 years. We've been thinking about this, and an opportunity opened up. We were going to go to Europe. We had sort of narrowed in on France for some family reasons, and we mentioned to a friend that we were doing that, and she said, no, you've got to go to New Zealand, and she told us all about this place she had and where we should go, and we said, okay, and literally like 4 weeks later we had tickets. So
how long have you been there?
We're coming up on a year.
And do you have plans of ever going back to the States?
Yeah, we do. But we originally, this was supposed to be a year-long experience. We had planned on just coming for a year. And our kids have just slotted into schools and friends and are enjoying it. And particularly our older son, who's 15, he's just found a great group of mountain bike buddies. So we're now thinking, I mean, look, men make plans and God laughs. So we're well aware of that, but we are now thinking we'll stay another 2.5 years till he's done with what would be the equivalent of high school in the States.
Okay. Very, very interesting. I mean, we can go on about that. Me being a Brazilian living in Germany, I'm very much interested in people that, have have left their home country to live some sort of experience outside of their comfort zone. But let me ask you how you got started in finance.
Leo, it's really a crazy story, so I'll try and keep it short. Kind of matches up with the thing we were just talking about. This was like 95. I was an undeclared major at university, so I had no idea what I wanted to do. My wife had just graduated with a degree in finance. I came home from school one day and she had a good job, and she was looking through the paper at the help wanted ads. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm looking for a job." And I said, but you have one. And she said, "I know, I'm looking for you." And I was like, "Okay, great. What have you found?" And she found what we both thought was a security guard job, something to do with security. And so I went and applied for it, thinking like this would be perfect, right? An evening like bouncer, I could work the graveyard shift and still go to school, something like that. And it turned out to be a securities job, not a security job. And neither one of us really knew the difference. But so it was quite completely, honestly, by accident. I applied to be a security guard, got a job at Fidelity Investments, which had a huge call center in Salt Lake City, where I lived. And so I got into the industry totally by accident. But then just a couple months later, August of 95, when Netscape went public, and I'm trying to remember, was this 95 or 97? No, it was 95. When Netscape went public, I was there on the sort of, the kind of the trading floor of Fidelity, where we're taking all these phone calls. And it was crazy. And, I just started training. I still was getting over the fact that I wasn't a security guard, right? And it was crazy. Like, people were excited, and I thought, after sort of getting my feet underneath me, I thought this was a math job. I thought, like, everything I was learning in training was about formulas and spreadsheets, and 2 + 2 always equals 4. It doesn't matter how scared or nervous or worried you are, it always equals 4. Then this happened, and I was like, what is going on? And so I got into the industry quite by accident, but that experience really has kept me involved in the industry ever since. This experience of, it's not about math. It's not about spreadsheets. It's about emotion and behavior, and even deeper, it's about values, and that's what has kept me totally fascinated by the industry. How people use their time and their money as an expression of their values is really fascinating to me.
Reading your book and watching some of the presentations that you've given, I have the feeling that you're really good at explaining very difficult concepts in a simple way. And I'm wondering if this is a skill that you've developed over time, or is it you were born with it, or if it was a skill that you tried to acquire over time. Why did you think it was important?
I didn't know that I was doing that, to be honest. I didn't sit down and say, "Hey, I want to make complex things simple." It's just, and I thought, which is a whole other interesting topic about sort of the imposter syndrome feelings that we get. But I thought everybody did that. I thought everybody thought that way. But really, what it was, and I've thought a lot about this because I get asked this all the time. Like, how do I develop that skill? And I thought everybody thought that way, right? So what's going on is I love to look at problems. You can do it two ways. I love to do one thing, or I just can't handle complexity. Like, either way is fine with me. I love to look at problems and say, okay, what is it that matters in here? And there's a big difference between simplistic and elegant simplicity. What I like to do is find elegant simplicity. And I think that takes, you address a problem, and I can actually feel it right now as I'm describing it. Like, it's a calculation that's done kind of in your body, mm-hmm. not in a spreadsheet. Like, you dive into the problem, and things get really messy in there. And if I was drawing this, I have drawn this, it would be, a line that's just going along straight, everything's fine. And then you get into what looks like a giant ball of yarn, right? Mm-hmm. And you're exploring every option, like, well, what about that? What about that? You're thinking of all the nuances. This happens every single article I write, every image I do, every week for the New York Times. I think through the nuance and what could they, and what I'm trying to discover is like, okay, what's the main point here? What's the thing that matters? And then once you find the thing that matters, you've got to strip away all the stuff that doesn't or that could be distracting. And then when you do that, you come out the other side of that ball of yarn, and that ball of yarn to me represents complexity. And so I'm looking for the simplicity that lies, like Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the simplicity that lies on the other side of complexity. And it turns out that that's the way my brain worked. It was either lack of mental RAM, and I couldn't store all the complexity for very long, and I had to just wrap it up in a simple icon so that I could move on to the next. There wasn't room for two problems at once, so to wrap it up in a simple icon. Or it's just sort of this idea of like, can we find what matters here and focus on that?
Now, for people that are familiar with your work, they will know that you're very well known, among other things, for the sketches that you draw. So, did you start writing, or did you start sketching as a way to better be able to explain those seemingly difficult problems?
Yeah, it was totally an act of desperation. Right? I have no art background, no history, as should be obvious from the sketches. But I have.
They do the work. They really do the work.
Yeah,
they're amazing.
Yeah. Well, that was it was really an act of desperation, and I can remember the moment it happened. I was sitting and anybody who's in finance, in any sort of advisory role, where you've got to help clients make really important decisions, will have had this experience. I was sitting in a meeting. I worked at Merrill Lynch at the time. I was, like a high-end wealth manager, and I was sitting with clients who I cared deeply about, these people, and I knew about their goals and dreams, and they had cried in my office, right? And they needed to make a really important decision about money, and I was sure that there was a concept that they needed to understand in order to make the correct decision. These are smart, intelligent people. He was a doctor. She was a really successful technology salesperson, and they were smart, successful people. And I was trying to describe this concept, and I was just getting blank stares. And that's the thing that I think most finance people will be familiar with, just this sort of, and normally it's nodding heads, yes, like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And they walk out to the car and look at each other and like, did you understand anything they said? And so I knew I wasn't getting there. Mm-hmm. And I was like, no, like this. And I was trying. And I thought I was really good at this. And again, it wasn't their fault. They're smart, successful people. This was my fault. Like I couldn't do it. And so out of an act, there was a whiteboard behind me. And I remember standing up and going, no, like this. And I think I just drew a couple of boxes and some circles with some arrows going between them. It was like the flow of money, like you're going to have money here and it's going to go here. And I remember the mood in the room. Even before I actually drew anything, I remember the mood in the room lightening up. Like, oh, whiteboard, hey, I'm going to understand. We all get that sense. Like, and as soon as I drew it, they're like, oh, yeah, I get it. Right. And I became addicted to that moment. And it's not necessarily all about the images. It's just the moment where somebody goes, I get it. And so that's what started the images, was just really an act of desperation, or you could think of it as a pragmatic need to help somebody understand something. And I found, and I think there's good evidence, good data to back this up now. The bulk of us learn visually. Mm-hmm. And that simple visuals will augment our understanding. And so now I think of them as the sketches, I think of them as shortcuts and souvenirs. The good ones are both. It's shortcuts into an idea or a concept. And then also, again, sort of like the way my brain works, a souvenir of the learning experience. So you leave having just simply to remember a simple drawing, and you're like, oh, yeah. I remember that. So that's how they started. And then I just started, with abandon almost, right? Like you couldn't, I have a hard time doing, I've already drawn like 5 things for you on this, as we're talking in the air. I have a hard time talking without drawing now.
Really? Wow. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an interesting point because, as and I know this is not true only of the financial services industry, but I have the feeling that we, in this industry in particular, try to explain things in a way that we can sound smarter than everyone else. So whenever I see someone that is doing the exact opposite, which is what you're doing, I find it fascinating. And I'm wondering if you could give advice to maybe, I don't know if it has to do with the finance universities or, people working in finance in general, about the importance of being able to pass the information along and make sure that the other person actually understands what you're trying to sell them, if you're trying to sell them something, or if it's a simple concept, that we focus on understanding rather than sounding smart.
Yeah. Now, first, you have to let me rant just a little bit, because there's nothing about our industry. There's a lot of things about our industry that I think need to change. There's nothing that I think needs to change more than this. It's super frustrating to me because it's built on a total misunderstanding of our value, and and I'm talking particularly on front-end financial advice at this point, right? Like, I believe it's true in the private equity space, the venture space, all of it, but for sure on front-end financial advice. So you've got a financial advisor, a wealth manager, a financial planner, whatever you call yourself, sitting down, trying to talk to a client, and whether they are trying to absolutely old school sell them something, or whether they are trying, hopefully, more the case, they're trying to help them understand a concept so that they can help give them good quality, unbiased financial advice. All of that aside, the idea that we all have been trained that there's two things I think have gone on. It's seems to be a natural human progression that as you get more experienced in a field, you are interested in everyone else knowing that, right? Like, you want to appear smarter, and that's just sort of a natural thing. It's a little bit like weeds in a garden. They just sort of creep in, and you've got to protect against them. You've got to sort of check yourself at the door, like, what lingo am I using? What language am I using? Like, if the goal is a relationship of trust and understanding, using language that other people don't understand is absolutely not the right thing to do. Like, so there's either just this natural creep. That's one way to look at it. It happens with all professions. How many attorneys do you know that are more interested in crafting a monument to themselves than a document that gets the work done, right? And so it happens everywhere. Right, so we've got to guard against that. But the second thing that I think is happening more often than not that really drives me crazy is this idea that it's a sales technique, that it's our value, right? The old model that I'm going to dig a pit, throw the client in the pit, stare down at them and say, I'm the only one with a rope. Like, no one likes to be treated that way, no one. And yet that's what we're doing all day long, right? Like, look how smart I am, look how smart I am. And I think what happens, and so now I'll try to be a little gentler, is I think we're just worried that if we make it too simple, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten this email or this comment in workshops or keynote addresses is like, hey, but if I make it too simple, why would they need me? And I just want to beg your listeners to believe me, that is absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. If you take somebody to the simplicity on the other side of complexity, that's all they want. Like, some of them want to go a little bit through that ball of yarn with you, and our sort of stereotypical engineers may want to go through it more than others, but almost none of them want to do it all. I have tested this. The more I give away, the more I tell people specifically, you can do this on your own, the more they want help. And so and again, let me just give one last metaphor. The doctor is a great metaphor, and this really was a light bulb moment for me. I had a next door neighbor, super good friend, who was also a client. He was an ER doctor, and we'll just call him Dave. And Dave, had routinely taken care of. Dave and I climbed together and mountain biked together, and so he had sewn my head up on his dining room table, like he's taking care of our kid. He was the ER doctor, right? So and one time my daughter Grace was sick, and I needed to take her to he's like, yeah, take her to the ER. I'm on shift. Actually, I'm there right now. Just bring her up. So we take her up, and I can't remember exactly what was wrong, but it was serious enough to take her to the ER. We go through thing. Dr. Dave does a thorough diagnosis with a bunch of tests, and then he writes a prescription, and we leave, and I go to the scary place with all the people with white coats on, and I fill the prescription, and I sign some document that says I don't even know what it said. It probably said, like, if my daughter grows a third arm or whatever. Like, I just signed it. I went home. I didn't do a single bit of research. I didn't look at second opinions. I didn't type the name of the drug in Google. I didn't do any of those things. There's a fast forward like a year, and Dr. Dave referred me to a group of surgeons, and it was a big opportunity and a big account for me, and they asked me to come present on their big shared profit-sharing plan, retirement plan, and I prepared this huge, like 50-page PowerPoint, like we do in the industry, right? Like all the PowerPoints, and every one of them had 18 bullet points and, size 8 font and all that stuff, and I was going to go in and show them how smart I was, and I was walking through it with Dr. Dave, and I got like 2 pages, like to this page 2 in it, and Dave was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, "Dude, let me just ask you something." And he asked me about when I brought my daughter Grace to the ER. He said, "What did you leave with?" And I said, "Well, I left with a prescription." He's like, "Well, could you read it?" I said, "No, I couldn't even read it." He's like, "Did you get a second opinion?" "No." Did you type it in Google?" "No." He's like, "Well, why?" And I said, "Well, because I trusted your diagnosis." And he's like, "Just go write a prescription. Like, do you have a thorough diagnosis of this problem?" I said, "Absolutely." He's like, "Do you have a prescription?" I'm like, "Yeah, just go write a prescription." And I show up at this meeting that I'd planned, like an hour. They come out and they're like, "Carl, I'm sorry. We've had a bunch of stuff happen. We only have 15 minutes. And I said to them, "That's 5 more than I need." And I said, "Here's what you should do. Based on, blah, 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 blah." I demonstrated that I had a thorough diagnosis. Not that I was smart. Mm-hmm. Just that let me make this point, Leo, that people don't care at all about your solutions. They don't. They care about their problems. Mm-hmm. So I just demonstrated that I understood their problem. I didn't demonstrate that I was smart, or that I had a degree, or that I had CFP, or that I worked at this firm or that firm, or how big we were, or how big our computers were, or our staff, like all that crap that we do. I did none of it. Mm-hmm. All I did was demonstrate, I understand your problem, and here's the solution. They called me an hour and a half after I left that meeting and said, "Hey, move the account." And I'm not saying it happens that way all the time. I'm just saying if we spent more time getting good at understanding people's problems, asking questions, listening, thoroughly diagnosing, then the solution, the prescription, can be a single piece of paper. Right. Plus 50 pages of compliance disclosures, right? Like the appendix that we need to have. But I'm saying the solution can be super simple if the diagnosis is thorough. So instead of spending all your time getting better at selling, get better at listening, right? Get better at asking questions, because then the solution's simple.
Absolutely.
All right. Rant over.
No, very, very interesting. Very interesting story. So let me just move to one of your books, and I guess it's the book that you're most known for, The Behavioral Gap. What does the behavioral gap mean?
So it was just the behavior gap. So the behavior gap originally was this problem that I don't want to make any claim that I discovered it, right? It was just a problem that I stumbled upon at a particularly critical moment in my career, where I kept running into this same problem of building a super detailed, I'd gone and got my SEMA designation from, it's like 2 or 3 week thing held at Wharton, and I was working at a pretty high end shop at the time. We were doing some institutional consulting. And we developed a pretty detailed process for manager search and selection. We'd find that, the whole goal here was to find the best investment. We'd find the best investment. We'd put clients into it, 2 to 3 year, 18 months to, 24, 30 months later, our sell discipline would flag this thing. We would have to sell it. we'd buy a new one. And after a couple cycles of that, I realized like I had created a very disciplined, super rigorous way to buy high and sell low, and charge people money for it. And I like at that point I had the best training in the industry. I'm not a dumb guy. I was like, look, if my job is to find the best investment, and I can't seem to do it, I didn't know that nobody really can. I thought it was just me. I thought it was just kids from the hills in Utah. So I was ready to leave the industry, and then I ran across this data, and my favorite source of the data is Morningstar. Dalbar does some work on this, and I don't even like to pay attention to the numbers anymore, but Morningstar puts this number at like 110, 120 basis points, that if you take the average investment, so the average mutual fund, let's say, and you compare the average mutual fund of a particular asset class to the average investor in the funds, and for the technical listeners there, right, it's just comparing time-weighted rate of return to dollar-weighted rate of return. Mm-hmm. There's a gap there. The average investment does about 100, let's just call it 100 basis points, 1% per year, better than the average investor in the fund during the time, because they're moving in and out and changes. The better way to state it is the average investment does about 1% better than the average dollar in the fund during the time. And I was like, what? That's not just me? Mm-hmm. Right? That's like the whole industry? And I was like, I felt like I had just discovered America, right? I was like, does anybody else know about this secret? Right? And I thought, all we have to do is start educating people on it. It turns out it's not about finding. What that research said to me was, I could own a mediocre, sort of by definition, I could own the average fund if I just behaved correctly. Mm-hmm. I would outperform 99% of my neighbors, and that's sort of what life was about in America. Still is about in America, right? Outperforming your neighbors. So I was like, that's amazing. I think I can do that. And so I started focusing on behavior, and I of course I was sketching everything at the time, and I remember describing it to clients like, no, do you realize I thought this was my job, and you thought this was my job, find the best investment. Turns out that's not my job. And I would draw a bar chart, and I would label that one bar the average investment, and I would underline mint, M-E-N-T, right? Mm-hmm. And then I used to put numbers on it. Now I don't put numbers on it because, again, that's one of those things people want to argue about the data and miss the concept. So now I just put this bar, average investment, and then next to it I put a smaller bar. And I write average investor and underline the OR. And to help people understand, you are not an investment. You're an investor. And then that gap between the two, I would just label the behavior gap. Mm-hmm. This gap is due to your behavior. And so that's how it started. Now it's really grown to be, now I use that concept to mean any well-intentioned behavior. Right? The search for the best investment was a well-intentioned behavior. Mm-hmm. Any well-intentioned behavior that actually is non-productive, at the very least, it's a waste of time. But in most cases, it's costing you something. Right. And I could give you examples with time, budgeting, food. There's all sorts of things where we're like, wait, I thought that was good for me. It turns out it's actually harmful for me.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think we are harming ourselves when making investment decisions? Why are we so bad at picking the right time to buy and sell, whatever it is?
It's almost a genetic. Well, here's the better way to say it, right? The very things that had been necessary for our survival as human beings, as a species, the very things that have been necessary for our survival as a species make us bad investors, right? The desire, like forever, safety has been in crowds, in a herd. Forever, if you stepped out of that herd, you would get killed. Forever, we've looked for the shaman, the wise, to tell us what the future will bring. When will the rains come? Where are the buffalo? Forever, we've been looking for those people, right? And so when you combine, we are hardwired. We actually are hardwired. Like Jason Zweig's book, Your Money in Your Mind, or Your Money in Your Brain. I can't remember the name, but it's Your Money in Your Brain, I think. They did a fascinating study. We are hardwired to get more of the things that give us security or pleasure. We're hardwired for it. Mm-hmm. And to get away as fast as we can from stuff that we perceive as painful. when you translate that, right, it kept us alive as a species. If we hadn't been that way, we would have been eaten a long time ago by saber-toothed tigers, right? Mm-hmm. But if you translate that into behavior with the markets, we are hardwired to want to buy things that have gone up, and we're hardwired to want to sell stuff that has gone down. We're actually genetically wired to want to buy high and sell low. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually a unique individual that can rush in when everybody else is rushing out. Because again, there we are with like going against the herd. It's a unique individual. Warren Buffett is a unique individual, you know, to use a way over stereotype example. So that's why. I mean, I could go on and on and on about examples like that, but that's at its fundamental core. If you were to design a bad investor, and this is, by the way, this is a generic statement. I mean, I'm not pointing at anyone individually, so any of you who are ready to be offended, don't be offended, right? Like, if you were to design a bad investor, you would design a human. Everything about us is right. Now, that doesn't mean, absolutely, there are plenty of great investors out there. Well, they've either done one of two things. They were either born with just a different set of traits, and that's what Buffett says. He says, if I was born in any other time, I would have been eaten by a lion. Right? It's just my particular genetic makeup, and I have another friend like this, a guy named John Montgomery, who runs an investment firm called Bridgeway, and John runs in when everybody else is rushing out, and he doesn't even. It's not a trick he's done. It's just like. It just makes sense to him. It feels like the right thing to do. So you've either that, or you've set up all sorts of interesting heuristics, right? Interesting mental tricks that you play on yourself, or you just are able to grit your teeth and do it. And I know plenty of people like that too. Like, okay, this is the time that I've been told I'm going to rebalance, and you force yourself to do it. I think of those as guardrails, behavioral guardrails.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned in your book that the actual investment decision is only a small part of your overall financial plan. And, I mean, we can talk about, you know, what you think of the financial plan in the realm of your whole life plan later, but why do we focus on that small part of the financial plan, the investment decision, rather than focusing on the rest of it, the things that you've been mentioning now?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of ways you could go. Let's just narrow this down for the sake of clarity. The investment decision versus ongoing behavior is one thing I think I may have been pointing out there, but we are trained by the industry, and that's writ large, right? Like just the whole financial services industry, including the financial pornography network, you know, CNBC. We are trained by that industry. I think of it as like the circus part of our industry, that what it means to be an investor is to argue incessantly over whether we should take a plane, a train, or an automobile on a trip without ever having decided where we're going, right? So what I'm just suggesting is that we there's two things that go on. One, if you can't answer, this has been my favorite experiment. I've been doing this the last couple of years in all sorts of places. I know it's weird, but I would just ask people I just met, like, why are you, I would ask a why question. Often it was why. If you want to have something fascinating for your listeners, you should try this, listeners. Just ask friends, prospective clients, just ask, why are you invested the way you're invested? Why is your money invested that way? Just ask that question. Mm-hmm. And the answers you'll get are unbelievable. I mean, the answers you can imagine would be something like, well, I read about it. You know, the sophisticated people will say, I read about it in The Economist, right? But most, you'll hear people say, well, I heard, you know, the circus clown on CNBC, on the Financial Pornography Network, yelling about it, right? Or I saw it on the newspaper, or my buddy at the club told me. Or you'll hear and you will almost never hear the only correct answer. There's only one correct answer. And the only correct answer is, well, I'm invested this way. You know, it's some version of this. I'm invested this way because it gives me the greatest likelihood of meeting my goals. Right? Like that's the only right answer for an institution. This portfolio gives us the greatest likelihood of meeting our spending policy. It's the only answer for an individual. Like, this portfolio matches, but almost no one, and I mean that, like almost no one, has taken the time to make the connection between what you say is important to you or your goals and how you actually invest the money. And it's crazy. Like, even saying that out loud sounds so unbelievably obvious, but almost no one has done it. And so that's what I mean, is stop arguing over who the smartest guy is in the room. Stop arguing over whether you should take a plane, train, or an automobile, and start focusing instead on why you're going there or where you're even going. And then realize that even after that, okay, now you've got a portfolio designed based on your goals. Now comes the hard work. Like, the hard work is behaving, because we all know that portfolio, just because it's designed based on your goals, doesn't mean it's not going to go through some scary times. Mm-hmm. And you're going to be tempted to blow out of it. So that's what I mean. The investment decision and the investment process is only matters to the degree that it influences your behavior. And I think the best way to behave correctly over the long haul is have it linked to your underlying goals. The best way to say no to bad behavior is to have a much deeper yes, and that deeper yes needs to be linked to your goals. And that totally holds true for institutions as well as it does individuals.
Okay, so from what you're saying, I hear we need someone that may be able to help us stay on course and not, so that we don't make those bad investment decisions. And, we look at what's been happening in the financial advice industry, if you want to call it that, the rise of the Robo Advisors, the computer program that asks you a few questions, how risk tolerant are you on a scale from 1 to 10, and you think it's cool to say 10 and you go 10, but then actually when you're in a situation where your stock has gone down 20%, you start panicking. So I guess my question is, in a world where the majority of advisors are computer programs rather than people like you and me, how do we translate that into our decisions?
I'm a big fan of Robo Advisors because they have accelerated the process of getting clear about what the value of a real advisor is. And so, first of all, I think at least one or two, I know the guys at Betterment pretty well. I've been to their offices. I've seen what they're doing. And you can't underestimate what they're doing. Risk tolerance questionnaires I remember Dan Ariely, this was great, at the FPA conference and I can't remember where we were, but at one of the big FPA events, Dan Ariely spoke, and he said, risk tolerance questionnaires are the second dumbest thing your industry has ever done. And it was just at the rise of Twitter, and I was following along on Twitter while I was there. I was also following the comments on Twitter, and the most common comment was, like, if that's the second, what was the first? So, right, because risk tolerance questionnaires do exactly what you just stated, right? Like, what risk when the market's good? And what? I didn't mean to take that much. So, but you can't underestimate what the good robo-advisor. So if you think, I guess here's the point, if you think your job is to take somebody through a risk tolerance questionnaire and plug them into a portfolio, which I remember when that was my job, like 15 years ago, and it was pretty cutting edge at the time. You're crazy, right? Like, if you think that's your job, really portfolio design based on some attempt at uncovering risk, and I don't even care how sophisticated the attempt is, right? There's some people doing some really, well, I actually don't know that I agree with this, but there's some people who think they're doing some really great work around risk right now and uncovering risk. I'm not even sure risk tolerance as a concept exists, and if it does exist, I'm not sure you can. I think there's three problems. Does it exist? If it does exist, can you measure it? And if you can measure it, does it stay stable over time? I'm not sure that even exists, but there are some people doing some really complex stuff around that. Sophisticated stuff. And there are advisors who still think, using those sophisticated tools designed for advisors, that that's their job. And I'm just telling you, you are going to be eaten. Betterment can do that for 25 basis points or less, right? You're done. And so, and that doesn't scare me. That excites me, because what is left, what I still haven't, and I'm not saying they won't be able to. I don't see how they would be able to, but never say never. What I still can't see happening is empathy and trust as sort of a base level. The ability, you've got to realize that most of the time when you're making a big behavioral mistake, forget the portfolio design process, which again, I think a thorough diagnosis requires that a human being be there, and then a prospective client walks out the door and goes, oh my gosh, that's the first time I've ever felt understood around money. I can't talk with anybody about money, and that girl or guy just understood me for the first time. Mm-hmm. Right? So forget that for a minute. Let's say the portfolio is now designed. You want to blow out of it. Right? Mm-hmm. In that moment, you are making an irrational decision. We all know you're making an irrational. You probably even know, but it doesn't feel like it. My hand is on the stove. I don't care what you tell me. I'm going to take it off the stove. Right? And so what happens, if you've ever tried to help somebody who's behaving irrationally, and I have 3 teenagers, so I've tried to help lots of people who are behaving irrationally. If you ever try to help somebody who's behaving irrationally by reasoning with them, you lose. Right. You can't help somebody who's making an irrational decision by throwing rationale at them. Throwing facts and figures. Don't you remember this? And 50% of the time when people do this, they're upset. 89% of the time when it's just delete, sell. The only solution in those moments is empathy and understanding. Hey, I understand. You're the release valve for their anxiety. And so that's a completely different skill. And guess what? It's an awesome job. It's so much better than the one we thought we had. So much better. Because it's a sacred trust. It's an awesome, people have cried in your office. And you could say to them, okay, Leo, I understand. You're scared. I get it. And if it's true, which it generally is true for me, I will say, you know what? To be honest, I get scared when I read the news right now. Mm-hmm. So would it be okay if I quickly grabbed your file, right? I put you on hold for a second to let everybody relax. Fight or flight has taken place. They've made the hardest phone call they're going to make. I call it the please hold method. You put them on hold for 30 seconds. You grab their file. I know it's already up on your computer, right? You grab their file and you say, hey, Leo, when we first talked, and again in our last meeting 2 months ago, you told me the reason we're invested. I just want to double check. Are we still on the same page? You told me the reason we're invested is because you want to spend time with your family, mainly outside, and serve in the community. Is that still true? Oh, yeah, Carl, that's still true. But I'm scared. Okay, well, let me I just want to review before we get that. And that means that you want, and then you review some goals. That means you're focused on funding your kid's education account, and you want to take Fridays off so you can go mountain biking with your son, and you want to do this. Is that still, those are still my goals. Okay, right? We bring them out of this area where they were totally out of control and scared back to the foundation of why they're doing it. I don't know how that's possible on a deep, empathetic level by anybody other than a real financial advisor.
That's a very, very good point, very compelling. So I know that we don't have that much time left, so let me switch to some questions that we like to ask all of our guests that work in specific areas of finance. In your case, you're a financial planner. I don't know if you call yourself that anymore. You're an author. You're many different things. But if you were to advise someone maybe in their early 20s that would like to become a financial advisor, private wealth manager, whatever it is, what would be some piece of advice that would give him or her?
Don't do it. I'm just kidding. It's actually a phenomenal job. But here I get asked that question all the time, what should I study? And I think what I would really focus on, I'm not sure it's even finance anymore. Yes, you have to have, don't get me wrong, you've got to have the technical chops. So maybe it's a double major, right? It's finance and marriage counseling. It's finance and coaching. It's finance and psychology. It's just make sure you understand that it's about emotion and feeling. It's a lot closer to helping somebody. Anyway, I think understanding, get really good. Here's the advice. Get really good at asking great questions and listening. get really good to something closer to coaching than explaining spreadsheets.
Okay. Yeah, very, very good advice. Now, do you have any books aside from your own that you recommend people to read if they're interested in this field?
That's such a good question. I've so removed myself from, because I've read them all.
You live in New Zealand.
And I live in New Zealand. Here are some things that I would read anything that Morgan Housel writes. Morgan Housel. Mm-hmm. I would read, and just because his understanding of markets and investing is awesome. I think that George Kinder, if you want to sort of go way out on the pendulum towards what is, I guess, referred to as life planning, George Kinder is the father of life planning. And so to sort of, I think it can be a shock to the system to spreadsheet calculator financial advisors to read it. So I almost think it's good. Go read it and just put down your bias for a little bit. His book, I think, was called The Seven. Oh man, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but just type in George Kinder and 7 Stages of Money Maturity, something like that. Super good in terms of understanding that side of the business. So those are 2 places I would go.
Yeah, very good. I'll make sure to link up some of his books on our show notes as well. Now, before I let you go, where can people find out more about what you've been up to at the moment and where they can get in touch with you?
So there's really let me just give you 2 or 3 ideas. So one, if you go to realfinancialadvisors.com, we just started the Society of Real Financial Advisors. It's been a thing I've been joking about for years. I used to call it the Secret Society of Real Financial Advisors, and we're now going to make it not so secret. So we're going to be doing more and more there. So if you go to it's realfinancialadvisors.com, you can throw your name in there when we sort of start doing some updates. I'm going to be doing a bunch of master classes online that will all be free, and we've started doing a 4-week deep dive course called the RFA program, the Real Financial Advisors program. So that's where all my work with financial advisors will be, is at realfinancialadvisors.com. And then if you're interested in my work generally around behavior, and right now I'm working on a project, a new book that's around doing scary things. And it'll probably be another 12 months till it's actually out, but we're already releasing pieces of it. That is happening at behaviorgap.com. So if you go to behaviorgap.com, there's a course there now on the imposter syndrome that's free. You can sign up for the weekly newsletter. And those are probably the 2 best places. I mean, Twitter has been a pretty active place for me, but we're using it now mainly as a sort of broadcast medium to say, hey, go be on the newsletter, because I do a lot of interaction via email and I love it. I get hundreds of emails a day that I read and interact with, and I love it. So I'd go to behaviorgap.com if you're interested in my general work and a new book on kind of doing scary things and overcoming fear to do meaningful work. Or if you're interested mainly in the financial advisor work I'm doing, go to the Society's page.
Okay, perfect. Look, Carl, it's been a real pleasure to have you on. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. We could have enough content for another 2 to 3 shows here, but I want to be cognizant of your time and want to thank you for actually taking the time and waking up at 6 in the morning in New Zealand to talk to us.
Lee, it's been my pleasure, and thank you. Look, this is generous work. Nobody's forcing you to do this, so thanks for the work you do and the impact it has on the industry, and keep it up.
Thank you, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Wall Street Lab podcast. For the show notes and much more, visit us at www.thewallstreetlab.com. To see what we're up to before anyone else, subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast constitutes the opinions of individuals and should not be treated as investment, tax, financial, or legal advice. We take no responsibility for the accuracy of any statements made in this podcast. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, and it does not contain an offer to sell or buy any sort of financial products, and should not be treated as advertisement for such. Any copying, distribution, or reproduction of this podcast without the prior permission of the creators of the podcast is strictly prohibited.